Welcome to Babel, Translating the Middle East, a podcast from the Middle East program at CSIS. Here on Babel, we take you beyond the headlines to take a closer look at what's happening in the Middle East and why it matters. This week on Babel, I speak with Max Gallien, a political scientist specializing in informal and illegal economies in North African politics. He's a research fellow at the Institute of Development Studies and the International Center for Tax and Development at the University of Sussex. Together, we discuss the political, social, and economic functions of smuggling economies in North Africa. Then I continue the conversation with Martin Pimentel and Todman to discuss what factors lead Middle Eastern states to ignore or even condone smuggling by their citizens. To translate some of what's happening in the Middle East, this is Babel. Max Gallien, welcome to Babel.
Thank you very much for having me.
How much smuggling is there in North Africa?
Oh, way more than people think. It waxes and wanes depending on what's going on at the border, and there's been an odd kind of economic obsession with trying to measure it. The problem with that is always that the second you do these measurements, 2 weeks later, they're entirely out of date. The World Bank once estimated that about a quarter of the gasoline that is consumed in Tunisia has been smuggled into the country from Libya or Algeria, but that study is from 2014. That number is not correct anymore. But I think we can say that across the Middle East and North Africa, there has been smuggling going on for as long as these borders have existed. And that smuggling has taken a great variety of different goods, people across these borders. That obviously includes the things that we often talk about and think about, narcotics or weapons. But way more often than that, it's the things we think less about: gasoline, foodstuffs, microwaves, mobile phones, donkeys, Hello Kitty backpacks, racehorses. It's a huge variety of goods that are being smuggled and that often provide an opportunity for income and for employment for people in these border regions.
So why are people smuggling them instead of trading them in normal ways or the orthodox ways that we think about people trading goods?
For some goods, your weapons, your narcotics, there's no legal trade route. But again, these are a minority of the goods that are being smuggled. For way more of these goods, the reason is that there's a formal trade route, but that trade route might be more expensive, might be associated with tariffs and taxes, or that trade route might be monopolized by large actors, by politically connected firms that have a lot of influence in what is allowed to be imported through ports or airports. So it's partly regulatory reasons, taxes and tariffs, but also reasons that are often more deeply rooted in the political economy of the countries that we study.
What's the relationship between smuggling these untaxed goods that you're talking about and smuggling illicit goods, as you mentioned, people, drugs, weapons?
It's somewhat difficult to generalize because obviously these dynamics somewhat differ border by border, but I think that relationship is much, much weaker than we often think. There's been this narrative for the last 20 years or so of the kind of dirty entanglements and the dark underbelly of globalization. And that narrative often assumes that armed groups and organized crime groups and different types of smugglers all benefit from a certain porosity of borders, that they're all kind of in cahoots with each other. And I think if you look at the operations of smugglers across many borders, and if you talk to them, you'll notice that their interests often are quite divergent, and that the types of goods that people will take across borders are often very different. If you're smuggling Hello Kitty themed backpacks across the border into Tunisia, the experience that you have if you're going to get caught is very different than the experience if you have a car full of cocaine. So the likelihood that you're going to mix these goods is relatively limited. The likelihood that you're going to transport people who are on watch lists in the same car in which you're going to bring couscous or pasta across is quite limited. So smuggling groups often specialize in certain goods, specialize in certain routes, and there's often not quite as much overlap as we think there is. So again, the smugglers who bring maybe mobile phones across might not only not be smuggling cocaine, but might have very, very different interests from the group that are smuggling cocaine.
Although it does seem to me that if you can smuggle Hello Kitty backpacks or mobile phones and figure out who to pay off, either in terms of the police or the border guards or something else, that once you start that way, it can be sort of a gateway drug to drugs or something more serious. That the issue is first finding people who can be corruptible and then corrupting them on a larger and larger scale. Is that something you've seen, or are there sort of barriers to that phenomenon?
That is certainly something that exists. And I think it's worth noting that Smuggling economies are dynamic. We have seen certain types of smuggling networks collapse in certain border areas. And whenever that happens, that opens up a labor market for other networks to draw on. We have also absolutely seen smugglers graduate from one type of product to another. Interestingly enough, what we often see is them graduating from illicit products to licit products, from shady businessmen to a pillar of the community that invests in local kind of cafes or wedding spaces. So people transition from these networks in different ways. But I think the important thing to notice is that the avenues through which narcotics or guns are being smuggled across these borders and the avenues through which, for example, backpacks or textiles are being smuggled are often very different. One of the features of the fact that a lot of licit goods are being smuggled is that fixed rules and agreements and structures have developed on how these goods can be smuggled. That's partly a function of just the sheer volume that has to come through. You can't negotiate for every backpack with every single corrupt customs officer. So it looks a little bit different depending which border you're at, but the common feature is often that there are broad rules on what can be brought through, by whom, for what payment, through which point in the border. And these rules are often good specific. These rules will apply to things like carpets or microwaves. They might say, we're allowed to bring in 2 microwaves and 3 carpets, and you're going to have to pay this policeman that much. They often don't apply to narcotics. So the types of ways in which you bring narcotics through the border and the ways in which you bring backpacks or carpets are often quite different. They require different levels of capital, they require different levels of connections, and they often follow different rules, and there's often very different people involved in them.
When you start talking about rules and money, it suggests we're talking about politics. What is the relationship between politics and smuggling in North Africa?
It's an excellent question that is the subject of my book. It's, I think, a complicated and interesting question because it's a question that we often come through with a certain reflex. It's very easy for us to jump to the assumption that this is inherently subversive, that this is undermining states and borders in North Africa. One of the things that I found when I started tracing the effects of these rules, when I started tracing the rent streams and the income streams that come out of them, was that I think in a way it's been an informal income generating program for regions that have been excluded from formal rent streams. So I found that it really has been part of a very specific mode of state building in many parts of the region, where post-independence elites often concentrated formal rent streams in the political center and explicitly tolerated smuggling, cross-border trade, immigration, and other kinds of activities in regions in which they did not concentrate formal rent streams, and often communicated that quite explicitly as a kind of informal subsidy to elicit the tacit toleration of formal state building efforts. So from that perspective, smuggling is not necessarily subversive, but is part of a particular mode of state building. Now, it's part of a particular mode of state building that comes with certain features, certain disadvantages. I'm certainly not advocating for it. But I think it's important to recognize that it is part of common history. It's part of a development which the state is very involved. It is not necessarily something that's come from the outside, even though it's politically always been very opportune to frame it like that. But that is endogenous. It's part of these histories, and central state actors are often very involved in it.
Do you see regime type affecting the way smuggling networks arise? That is, are more authoritarian regimes more susceptible to certain kinds of smuggling, or more open to certain kinds of smuggling? More democratic regimes to different kinds of smuggling, understanding that there are very few real democracies in the Middle East, but it's on a spectrum. Does the spectrum matter?
That's an excellent question, and Tunisia is an excellent case study for it. The macro structure of smuggling that we've seen in Tunisia for the last few decades broadly emerged out of the 1970s, 1980s. There's been smuggling before that, there's been changes since that, but a lot of the kind of larger structures of smuggling, especially of consumer goods into Tunisia from Libya and Algeria, broadly stems from that time. So we can kind of look at the development of state engagement and state toleration of smuggling in Tunisia from then to today. And while my work is primarily kind of starting about 2014, we have the great advantage that there's a couple of excellent pieces of work from Tunisian scholars, both before and after that. And the interesting finding is that there's more stability than we would think, that states under different leaderships, under different authoritarian rulers, but also under different governments in its democratic period, have all broadly recognized that smuggling across its borders is a central part of how borderland communities are currently operating, and that dramatically interfering with that is politically very risky. You will find governments across all stripes and regime types making very aggressive statements about their border communities. And it's very politically opportune to frame smuggling as something that's coming from outside, that is subverting the nation. But if you look at the de facto policies on the borders, the broad toleration of smuggling, as long as it doesn't cross certain red lines, the broad understanding that this is important for borderland communities, which themselves are important for stability and security, it's been pretty constant across regime types.
I understand that most of your attention's been on North Africa. Your book is about two communities in North Africa on the Moroccan border and on the Tunisian border. But I'm sure you've had exposure through your work to other places. Is North Africa, in your mind, fundamentally similar to many places around the world, or is there something special about North Africa that makes it different from other places?
I think in many ways it's extremely similar to other places across the world. Obviously, every borderland is different. Infrastructure plays a role. The type of goods that run through there plays a role. The political settlements on both sides of the border play a role. But the overall dynamic that I'm observing, the fact that smuggling is highly regulated, that states are deeply involved in it, that it's a feature of a certain type of state building that is kind of now being awkwardly renegotiated, that's incredibly common, especially across sub-Saharan Africa. I think it probably says something about how we study geopolitics and political economy in the Middle East, that we've not always been as attuned to that as people in other regions. I think there's an emphasis on securitization, there's an emphasis on connecting it to the movement of armed groups, which means that I think we've not often picked up on these things in the Middle East and North Africa as much as we should have.
And more specifically, in the Middle East, as you know, there's huge global attention to the war in Gaza right now. Gaza has had, according to Israeli accusations, tremendous amounts of smuggling, a whole economy built up on the Egyptian Gaza border. Well, I understand you're not an expert on Gaza. When you read about Gaza, does Gaza strike you as fundamentally similar or fundamentally different from the kinds of phenomena you're seeing around the world?
You said it correctly. I'm not an expert in Gaza, and I'll just say that as a caveat up front. But I would look at it as an extreme case rather than a very different case. As I said earlier, the infrastructure that we have at borders shapes what happens at these borders. The political dynamics between countries shape what happens in borders. And consequently, in a variety of ways, Gaza presents an extreme case, partly due to the heavy fortification and militarization of that border, the heavy investment in infrastructure, and partly due to the imbalances and inequalities on both sides of that border. But I think consequently, because it's an extreme case, it reminds us of some things that are true across many borders. The first is the fact that smuggling in many ways can have negative economic consequences, but in contexts of crisis, it can also bring food and essential goods to people that don't have them otherwise. And I think we can find examples of that in Gaza. It's also a case where kind of geopolitics and sanctions regimes play a really strong role in how smuggling networks develop. Iran is the other excellent case study for that in the region. And I think finally, it's a reminder of the fact that border infrastructure often has unpredictable consequences, that I think we don't have a good enough understanding yet of the effects of border infrastructure. The second part of my book is on the effects of border infrastructure in North Africa. And it really highlights that some of its primary goals are often not achieved, but some of its side effects are often particularly brutal for vulnerable and marginalized populations across borderlands. And I think we find examples for that throughout the region.
In your experience, are all states trying to stamp out smuggling? Should they try to stamp out smuggling? Should they try to be regulating it in a different way than they are?
I definitely don't think all states are trying to stamp out smuggling. I think all states are trying to be seen to stamp out smuggling. But also, that can be different for different types of smuggling, right? We can see states tolerating the smuggling of blue jeans, but really cracking down on the smuggling of gasoline because, it's undermining their own supply. All that being said, I think states are aware that it has a political function, that stamping it out has social consequences, economic consequences, and political consequences. And I think this awareness explains some of the patterns of where we see cracking down and where we see states tolerating it. Should they crack down on it is an excellent question. And I think cracking down is the wrong language here. I think the big problem with smuggling is we approach it as a law and order problem. While I think it's often a political and historical problem, it's a legacy. The prevalence of large smuggling economies in a borderland is a legacy of how that borderland has been economically developed or often underdeveloped. So hitting that with a stick is counterproductive and often very poorly received for very good reasons. Now, if we look at borderlands that have been heavily developed through smuggling economies, we don't necessarily find indication that that's a great state building model. It's often highly unequal. It often produces enormous disparities in wealth. It is often highly gendered in who has access to these networks. It can produce activities that, even if they are structured, are often still highly violent. And if you talk to smugglers in southern Tunisia, for example, they'll often perceive part of their daily job as something that is very challenging, often undignified. So we don't want to advocate for this as a state building model. However, if it's been presented to borderland communities as an economic livelihood opportunity, then just taking that away creates an economic crisis. And it also creates a sense of historical injustice. People will tell you things like, well, the state didn't give us anything, but they tell us, okay, we'll open a window for you. So if you close that window, you have to open another window. And that's been one of the most fascinating things to see about what's happened in Tunisia and Morocco as smuggling networks in these countries have collapsed as a result of border infrastructure, is people protesting not the state that built the border, but the state that they're in. Protesting in Tunisia whenever the Libyans closed the border and said, all right, guys, this is being closed over there. You have to give us something else. There's a social contract being negotiated here, kind of what I call an informal authoritarian bargain. So I don't think states should fight it, but I think states should rethink the economic development models that they're applying in their borderlands and should think about what alternative economic development in these regions look like.
So, how should states engage differently with smuggling and smuggling phenomena in your mind?
I think the starting point is to move away from it as a purely law and order issue or a purely securitized issue as a development issue and as something that needs to be developed in conversations with borderlands, with an understanding of what alternative development models in those regions look like. There's been a heavy emphasis over the last few decades on border infrastructure. The number of border walls across the world has quadrupled in the last 20 years or so. And there's not any indication that that's been a very successful innovation. But I'm German. We have a long history of the fact that border walls do not always do what we think they will. But I think the alternative to that is more complicated. The alternative of what do border regions look like if we integrate them into more formal trade channels, if we try to invest in different forms of infrastructure. We don't have a good sense of that yet. It's because I don't think there's been a lot of work in it. I don't think states have been seriously engaging in it. But every time I talk to other people, be it people who work in northern Niger, be it people who work in areas that are traditionally dependent on cannabis production, be it people in any areas where a lot of economic activity has been outside of formal channels, and that's a lot of places in the world, we don't have a great set of models for how these things are embedded into more formal economic rent streams.
But it seems to me that a large part of this also is people don't build a lot of border infrastructure to block the influx of Hello Kitty backpacks. They build infrastructure because of smuggling of people, drugs, weapons, and the consequence is the inability to smuggle Hello Kitty backpacks. There's a need to deal with the illegality. What the port master in Dubai told me one time, you have to differentiate between legal smuggling and illegal smuggling. How do you do that as a development task? Given first the money that's involved in illegal smuggling, as we've seen in Latin America, the corrupting impact of the money from illegal activity that people who might have more pure developmental motives are susceptible to, and it ends up bending these economies in that direction.
I mean, first of all, I think you just gave a better description of the problem than I could have. That is, I think, exactly the challenge. You're exactly right. We don't build the walls to crack down on the smuggling of carpets or backpacks. But that is the first effect of the wall. So I think one of the things that we see when we look at the construction of border infrastructure in a variety of places is that the highly capitalized networks, the guys who are bringing the cocaine across, they usually have no difficulties getting across border infrastructure. They're capitalized enough, they're usually connected enough, and their profit margins are substantial enough that they usually have no difficulties with that. We've seen heavy investment in border infrastructure in North Africa over the last decade. We've seen the almost complete collapse of a variety of networks that employed hundreds of thousands of people in small-scale smuggling across these borders with very severe impacts on these communities. There's been almost no indication that drug smuggling networks, and especially, for example, cocaine smuggling networks, have been affected by this whatsoever. And I mean, if you look at a border like the border between Tunisia and Libya, good luck securitizing that one, and especially good luck securitizing that one without the active support of the border population. One of the things that's a really important part of the story of how governments in North Africa have regulated and structured their borders is that communication with border communities has been really important. Information passed to security services by border communities has been really important. So alienating border communities while building infrastructure that's not doing the thing you meant to do has not been terribly successful. I think the answer for highly capitalized networks, including narcotics, doesn't just lie at the border. I think it's safe to think that that can be cut down through border infrastructure at the border. Borders are too large and these networks are too highly capitalized. I think that tends to needs approaches that looks at all parts of the value chain and looks at the production, looks at the consumption, and everywhere in between.
But it also seems to me that the approach that you're describing is really almost a counterinsurgency approach to win the support of communities, to build trust, to identify who the bad guys are through working with the community and providing an alternative. I mean, that's what the U.S. tried to do in Iraq for quite some time.
I think, yes, certainly working with communities is really, really important there. I think it has an even stronger economic aspect, an even stronger recognition of the degree to which communities have been economically dependent on that, which makes it so difficult to engage with policymakers on this because this also makes it often very, very expensive. But I think it's also a recognition that the lines that we draw there between the good guys and the bad guys and the robbers and the cops and all that are often not that clear. And that state security services have heavily benefited from smuggling across these borders, have been complicit and involved in smuggling across these borders, and partly not as a result of individual corruption. Certainly, they've also benefited from it personally, but partly as a result of the fact that there's been state policy to structure a lot of these things and let a lot of these things pass. And I think that is something that border communities are very aware of, and that kind of drawing that line and assuming that the state is trying to crack down on this and the state is the cop and everybody else is the robber is, I think, also drawing a line that makes it very, very difficult to meaningfully engage with border communities on this kind of topic.
Max Gallien, thank you very much for joining us on Babel.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Why do many states in the Middle East rely on informal economic bargains to placate certain segments of their population?
It seems to me that for some governments that don't want to have to provide for everybody, deciding that you'll let other people provide for themselves under different kinds of circumstances is sort of a compromise. So as long as nobody's being hurt by the smuggling, the state feels we're giving up some of the tax revenues, but it doesn't come out of our pocket. The smugglers feel that they have a way to sustain themselves. People in marginal border areas feel they're getting things at a lower price. And you could kind of argue that really everybody wins, and the people who don't win are the tax collectors in capital cities. But tax collectors in capital cities are no more popular in North Africa than they are in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, I don't think this is unique to the MENA region. I think this happens in a lot of states around the world, and particularly states that have weak governance or limited resources. I think allowing smuggling activities to happen in certain areas gives states some more flexibility to be able to focus on their priority areas, which are likely to be major cities, maybe coastal areas. And by allowing informal economies to spread elsewhere, they have more flexibility in terms of being able to intervene in those areas when they want to, but not feeling obliged to do so. And I think this comes to a sort of cost-benefit analysis for some of these states, where the costs of missing out on that tax revenue is less of a risk, perhaps, than disenfranchising these populations and turning them into areas of unrest if they are taxed, but then don't feel that they get the benefits that they expect from that. So I think it allows flexibility, and it's also a cost benefit analysis. But it's probably also worth saying that there are large communities in parts of the region, particularly in peripheral areas, that don't want to be part of formal government structures. They reject efforts to formalize them and to bring them into these economic processes that might involve having to pay tax and things like that. I'm thinking of an example from Tunisia where there are these informal garbage collectors who have really strongly resisted efforts by various international actors as well as by local civil society organizations to bring them into that formal economy. They really don't want that. They don't trust the government, and they would rather have the flexibility of providing for themselves and not having their expectations of the government be let down when the government doesn't provide for them.
That being said, when the government wants to come in like a ton of bricks, it can. But in a way, by acknowledging that they're not going to come in, the government sort of pays tribute a little bit to local leaders. The local leaders know that their business models are dependent on the government turning a blind eye. So there are ways in which it weaves these areas into national governance the way they want to be. As Will says, they don't want to be directly under the thumb, but there's an understanding, there's an accommodation, and it kind of works for everybody. And for the government, that's a cost they're willing to pay because it gives them the benefits that they want. And when they need to have control, they can come in and say, if we don't get what we want, the game is up for everybody.
Looking beyond smuggling, how else do MENA states appease marginalized populations?
One of the most famous examples, I think, in the MENA region is employment in the public sector and giving out public sector jobs to people who otherwise might be unemployed is a really key way of trying to appease them, trying to provide some kind of benefits. And of course, lots of these public sectors are famously not very productive. There's this widespread idea in Iraq that the average Iraqi public servant works for an average of 17 minutes a day. I don't think that's true, but if you speak to Iraqis, a lot of them will quote that to you. And so I think that's one piece. Also, I think some governments provide preferential access to services, particularly at key times. In Lebanon, quite often local politicians will provide a boost in electricity access in advance of elections or certain key moments, maybe when MPs are going back to visit their home districts. And so I think that's one way of trying to appease local populations. And then one other piece of this is when things really break down and you get to a conflict situation, sometimes states or governments will allow people to engage in really unlawful activities, looting, extortion, things like that. Before I joined CSIS, I'd been doing work on sieges in Syria and the siege economy. And there was quite a widespread belief that soldiers were sent to the checkpoints around sieges as a kind of reward, having been in particularly difficult fighting situations before. And the reason that was a reward was that they could seek bribes for allowing certain goods to pass through those checkpoints or people to get out of those checkpoints into and out of besieged areas. And so this was a system that was, if not a formal system, it was really widespread. And that was just one way of getting the support and maintaining the support of people when the government wasn't able to do that themselves.
Well, the most obvious way is through subsidies, and governments in the Middle East in general subsidize a wide number of goods, often energy, food staples. That's expensive for a government. A government often has to buy things on the world market at global prices and provide them to their local population at well below global market prices. And that's an actual cost. Here, governments aren't buying anything. They're not actually outlaying money. And so I think for a number of governments, this seems like a much better deal. The problem is you're in a government that subsidizes gasoline, for example, and the gasoline leaks out and is sold in other places, as is in North Africa, going from places where gasoline is subsidized to where gasoline is unsubsidized. I think there's a sense that some of that leakage is acceptable as part of the political bargain, but it's a cost. And as I say, in many cases, it's a cost that governments are willing to pay, because the alternative way of maintaining control in places you're not investing a lot in is repression or much higher subsidies or something else. It's just, you have to be involved and actually do it. And here you just don't get involved, and it sort of takes care of itself.
How can international actors influence the social contracts that states establish with their citizens? How malleable are these relationships between states and societies? And does it make sense to speak about these relationships in terms of a social contract at all?
Yeah, I think this is really hard to maneuver from a Western capital. We certainly have a sense for how governments should relate to their citizens. We have a sense for how society should work. And we certainly try to increase government capacity to deal with informality. The US government has a strong preference, as to other Western governments, toward formality. But it just strikes me that, especially when you're starting from the area of the periphery, and you're talking about places where the governments don't want to invest resources, persuading them to invest resources, the resources are fixed. And in many cases, investing resources in cutting down on informality in border areas on the periphery will mean there are less resources to do things in more central areas or to deal with things on higher priorities than Western governments have. So in a place where you have limits to what you can do, I'm not sure that this should be a huge priority for Western governments to convince other governments that they have to wipe this out, except when there are cases of arms, drugs, those kinds of things, where it really does affect Western governments' national security or other areas of high priority.
Yeah, when we think about international actors trying to shape these sort of social contracts, quite often we think about economic assistance and conditionality at the national level, thinking about organizations like the IMF and conditions on IMF loans. But that happens a lot at a local level through support to civil society organizations as well. And there are ways in which these kinds of groups can push to slightly shift the contours of these relationships. Sometimes they do try to work with groups who are working informally and try to at least find channels for them to engage more directly with government officials. That might not include properly integrating into formal economies or extending the government's authority over these areas, but at least to create new channels for them to share grievances and concerns and priorities and whatnot. And you asked about the malleability of them as well. And we might assume that some of this is easier in a democratic system, political system, where there are more formal channels to engage with the government. But I think if we sort of zoom out and look beyond smuggling, but just more broadly at some of the governments in the region that have really fundamentally changed their relationship with their people, sometimes it's authoritarian governments, particularly those with more resources, that are actually better able to do this. Certainly, Saudi Arabia is transforming the relationship that it has with its people. And I think that extends far beyond those living in the cities and the major urban areas, but to extend beyond into rural areas as well. And part of the reason I think they've been able to do that is because it's an authoritarian system where people are very afraid to oppose these measures. And so it might not play out exactly how we expect sometimes.
Jon, Will, thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Marty.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening to Babel. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the podcast on iTunes or Spotify or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can find more analysis on this topic linked in the show notes on the CSIS website, and you can find us on Twitter at CSIS Mideast.